lost the other person.
Oh my goodness. There we go.
You ready to go?
Ready.
Are we expecting one more? Or? Is he up there?
He's not, oh, there he is.
Okay, good. Good afternoon. Welcome to this Canmore Local Assessment Review Board hearing. I would like to remind everyone to please turn off any mobile devices or turn them to mute so we're not interrupted. I would also like to remind everyone that the ARB hearings are open to the public and that this hearing will be recorded and streamed live. The video recording will be our record of the hearing. We are here today to review the complaint and subsequent evidence as filed for tax roll 10546, municipal address 633 2nd Street, and the legal description is Plan 1095F, Block 77, Lot 12. I will start by introducing the panel, and then I will ask the parties to introduce themselves. After that, I will explain our standard hearing procedure and ask for comments in that regard. My name is Martin Buckley, and I am the presiding officer appointed to this panel. The panel members with me today are Michelle Ouellette to my left and Councillor Karen Mara to my right. Does anyone present have objections to the panel as constituted? The complainant? The complainant has shaken their head no. No complaints, or no, sorry, no objections. From the respondents, any objections to the panel as constituted?
No objections, thank you.
No objections, thank you very much. I'll have the parties introduce themselves, starting with the complainant. Would you please state your name, your role in the hearing, and whether or not you're the owner of the property?
Yeah, my name is Adrienne Blageau, and I am the owner of the property.
Okay, thank you. From the respondents, the same thing. If you could state for the record your names, organization, and your role with the municipality.
I'll go first. My name's Deanne Bannerman. I work for Benchmark Assessment Consultants, and we provide contracted assessment services for the town of Canmore.
Lance Wayloggy, Chair with Benchmark Assessments. Again, respondent for the town here today.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any preliminary matters to address?
None.
Complainant? No. Benchmark representatives, respondents, any preliminary matters?
Nothing, sir.
No, thank you. And none from the administration? Okay, thank you. So our standard practice is to first have the complainant present all of their evidence first, followed by questions from the respondent and then the panel. Next, the respondent presents their evidence, followed once again by questions from the complainant and then the panel. The complainant will then have an opportunity for rebuttal. Finally, both parties will have an opportunity to present their final arguments and summarize their evidence for the panel, with the complainant presenting first. If anybody needs a break or if a problem comes up, please let the panel know as soon as possible, and we can address those things as we go. Are there any questions regarding the procedure today, or is everyone satisfied with the process as was laid out? The complainant? Any
I'm
questions?
satisfied.
Okay, respondents?
We're satisfied.
Okay, thank you. I see both parties have exchanged the disclosure evidence before the hearing. To save time, I propose that we mark all the documents to the record now. That won't stop anyone raising questions about admissibility later. If any such questions arise, we can still deal with them and strike material from the record later if necessary. Is everyone comfortable with this procedure? Complainant
Yes.
and the respondent?
Yes, we are.
Okay, thank you. I will ask the administration to deal with the material. Sorry, taking a little while here. Okay.
Thank you. So we have complainant package marked C1, which is the complaint form of 3 pages. We have the complainant package marked C2, which is the complainant disclosure, which is 44 pages. We have the complainant package marked C3, which is the complainant rebuttal of 12 pages. And we have the respondent package marked R1, which is the respondent disclosure of 249 pages.
Okay, thank you. No other preliminary matters to deal with? I believe we can start the presentations, starting with the complainant.
Okay, thank you. Essentially, my complaint is that my house is unfairly assessed relative to the more common properties, like walkouts. And so one of the things I discovered as I was looking at this was that if you're assessed based on assessment practices in the book that I quoted, the guide for assessors, if you're assessed different than the common level, even though your assessment might reflect market value, you still have the right to request a reassessment if, in fact, there is a bias within the model. And so what I found as I looked at the data was that there's both a vertical bias and a horizontal bias. And those things, especially the vertical bias, especially concerning because it's regressive in nature. So that, a person who has $1 million home is very likely to have a asset ratio of 100% or more for their property. And the higher end properties are running in the 70 to 80%. And so I just don't see that as fair. But more specifically, it's kind of a subgroup thing as well. So my house is a traditional house, and it seems to be costed fairly effectively utilizing the model. But at the same time, houses that sold for the exact same amount as mine, look identical to mine in the Lions Park area, have assessments that are much lower. So I guess I don't really understand. Well, I do understand how that's happening in the model. What I submit is that I can have a complaint considered because horizontal equity and vertical equity are both expected out of the mass model, and the mass model doesn't deliver that. Let me just see what else I have here. So here's how I did it. I requested the 299-300 data from Benchmark, and to understand why, a house that sold for the same price as mine at the same time would be assessed so much less than mine 2 or 3 years later. I had a few theories, and so I picked properties that might help me understand what was happening in the model. I would have loved to have more data. I love data, but the cost is quite prohibitive, and I just want to mention that. So I had to spend $1,200 of my own money to get 12 properties in order to understand what was happening with my assessment. It's very prohibitive, and I don't think most people would invest that money. But I think I felt it was important. So what did I find out? Well, I found out there's 2 fundamental errors in the model, and they sort of impact, a small group of properties, but mine is one of them, unfortunately. And the 2 errors, well, first I'll tell you how it's calculated, because it seems like a bit of a black box to a lot of the people that I've been listening to who have had complaints. So essentially there's a manual and it has the costs of construction for 1-story, 2-story, 3-story, high quality, low quality. And they're just numbers, factors, constants, multipliers. And the model, the mass assessment model, will take that information and apply those factors to your property. And they'll get a number of the construction cost. And that construction cost, I think, when we were looking at it using the model that the cost manual that Benchmark is using, I think is in $2001, or the updated one is 2014. Either way, once you get that construction cost, you have to put it in terms of today's dollars. So construction cost, multiply a multiplier to get it to today's cost. And then the next piece is to add a market factor. And what the market factor does is adjusts for market conditions. Say one area is less desirable than another, or one house configuration might be less desirable than another. So in looking at the data, where I found the two problems were, the first one was the market factor. So the properties that I submitted that had that were in Lions Park, for example, so they're about the same distance from downtown. They look exactly the same as my property. That process happened, and they calculated the construction cost, which was equal, roughly, for our properties that are very similar and same distance from downtown. And then the next step would be to add a market factor. So in my case, the market factor is 270%. In the case of the other properties, which I would like to be compared to and treated similarly to, is 150%. So after calculating the construction costs, to then double the value of my house relative to the other house is it doesn't make sense to me. And I would question, or I would ask Benchmark, I would ask you to ask Benchmark how this factor is calculated and what market evidence supports such a critical factor. Because after all said and done, that factor changes the assessment significantly. In my case, my house is now double the value of the other home. So I would ask the board to investigate if that market factor being associated with my property is fair. I don't think it's fair relative to the other properties. The second thing that I found was, the second thing I found was how some of the houses I was looking at that sold for similar or have similar assessments to mine, but have much higher values. I wanted to understand why something had the same assessment as my property, but was worth $3.5 million on the market. Like, what calculation would result in that outcome? So I did request some of those properties that had the same assessment as me. And what I found out from those calculations is that the walkout levels, which are quite grand in some cases, in most cases, are costed like a traditional basement. So if you look at, I don't know if you can take a moment and look at Appendix 1, I think it was. Appendix 1, page 3. And I can just show it to you as well. But essentially, what's happening here is, if you look at this home here, it looks like a 1-story, 1.5-story home, right? And it's costed as a 1.5-story home. But in reality, it's actually got 2 walkout levels, 7,800 square feet, and it's costed, essentially at $600,000 less than it sold for. Sorry, it's assessed at $600,000 less than it sold for 3 or 4 years ago. So it's just a fundamental, if you don't calculate a value for these levels, then you're not reflecting market conditions. So that was sort of what the benchmark data helped me understand. And then I'd also want you to have a look at my initial submission on page 5. So on page 5, what you see here is something similar to what the first complainant this morning spoke of, is that, at one point he was, the subdivision had similar properties, they were assessed similarly, and then something changed, right? And so now his property, which was actually one of the lowest properties valued on that street, is now the highest valued property. And that doesn't make sense to him. And if I had a quick look at his street, and his street looks just like what I'm talking about. His lower level is above ground, but all above ground. And if you look at all 8 other houses, they have walkouts. So it just confirms that there's something missing in the model. And we all know that Kenmore has a lot of walkouts, especially in the price range that I'm in. And so I see the walkouts as more of the common level. There's usually 2 or 3 times more of those on the market at any one time than there are the traditional style home that I live in. I'm going to have to take a second because it looks like I'm running out of power. So if you just give me 1 second, I'm going to just plug in. It's not quite long enough. How's that? Okay, so back to my notes. So I guess the question I would ask you to ask the benchmark is, what has changed in how we're costing the houses that started in around 2021 that's causing higher assessments for homes like myself? And okay, yeah, then the next thing is the ratio study. So I didn't do a ratio study in order to audit the mass appraisal. I did the ratio study because it was recommended to see if what I was observing was mere chance or something statistically valid. And so I learned how to do a ratio study manually, and then I actually ended up finding some software that I could use for free to actually just produce the result. And what the results confirmed quite convincingly is that there is a vertical bias that's regressive in nature, as well as a horizontal bias between homes that have a traditional, no additional square feet, 1.5, 2-story homes, and homes that have a walkout. And the median difference between these is significant. So just the medians alone is 10%, which means roughly 12% more taxes than the equivalent value home that's a walkout. So the ratio study was not meant to be as an audit, and I don't want you to see it as an audit. I want you to see it as a way of accepting the information that I've provided is statistically valid and not a matter of chance. So what do I want? I would like the ARB to consider my reassessment utilizing the homes that I provided, that at least in my the homes that I provided, such that I'm not being compared to the homes that Benchmark provided that have a similar bias. It is impossible for me to get a fair assessment if I have to limit myself to the properties that have a similar error or bias within them. So that's what I'm asking, is that the board arrive at a reasonable value for my property, considering its relative value to the properties that I've identified, which are similar distance from downtown, similar quality, similar size. And yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say.
So that concludes your presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Bannerman or Ms. Wayloggy, have you any questions of the complainant?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Perfect. We do have a number of questions, Chair, and I tend to have a bit of a low voice. So at any point during my talk, if I do fall a little low, just interrupt me and ask me to speak up. We do have a lot of questions, Mr. Chair. Obviously, there's a lot of analysis and a lot of conclusions, and of course, we do have these questions through you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if we could start on what the complainant has labeled Appendix 3, horizontal equity. Can we start on that page, please? Question for the complainant. It appears you spent an awful lot of time on properties with walkout to analyze and then ultimately conclude, in your opinion, that properties with walkouts are underassessed. Is that fair to say?
Actually, no, I looked at all the data I could. It was painstaking, actually. What I did was I requested through a realtor a history of all the sales from the last 5 years, of which I used a subset. Painstakingly, I had to look at each one individually because the data I couldn't download the data. I actually had to look at each one, find the sale date, and look at its configuration. So I was in no way able to really know when I was looking at the data what I was going to see. And that's where it actually kind of got interesting, because every time I saw something underassessed and I actually looked at the layout and it was a walkout. So, but I looked at everything thoroughly, regardless of what it said. And I know you mentioned that there were some unknown. Well, some of them you just can't tell from the listing information. And so rather than trying to force it into a category, I just put it into unknown.
Oh, okay. But you did do some analysis there on Appendix 3, and ultimately you mentioned in your presentation that you believe that walkouts are underassessed. Is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and that's shown. I think you mentioned the median ratio on Appendix 3, which is 0.8638 versus properties without a walkout, which would be 0.9516. Is that correct?
Yep.
You're ultimately saying the ratio of properties with a walkout is substantially lower, therefore it would demonstrate that it's underassessed.
Either that or I'm overassessed relative to the common level. I would say there's a lot more walkout properties, and so they represent what we would say in Canmore, due to its geography, is more common in my price range than the traditional 1.5 story, roughly, little chalet. So the more common. So I'm saying I am overassessed rather than relative to the common, not necessarily that they're underassessed. There's more of them, so they represent the common.
Okay. So just to clarify, is that a yes or no? You think the walkouts are underassessed, or are they overassessed, or are they assessed fairly?
I think they're not. I think I'm sharing data that says we are not being assessed similarly with similar practices, and those two subgroups are different, and that's creating a bias that is in favor of the walkouts and causes me to pay more taxes relative to the market value of my property and the market value of their property. It's not really. That's the only conclusion I can take from that data. Okay,
I'm a little confused. I'm not sure if you concluded an answer there for me or not, but I'm a little confused because on Appendix 3, it appears that you're trying to demonstrate that walkouts are underassessed. Yet if you turn to Appendix 1 on page 2, at the top of the page, you're saying the net result of the calculation or value of the base fence. It's inconceivable that a builder or seller would place that much value to the market for these types of homes. So it seems like in Appendix 1, you're saying it's too much value. In Appendix 3, it's underassessed. So I'm just trying to.
Sure, let me just read that again, because maybe I didn't write it the way it was intended to be heard. So it's inconceivable. Let me just see here. What page was that on?
That would have been your appendix 1, page 2, right after the title.
Yeah. So what I'm saying there is inconceivable that a buyer or seller would value the walkout at roughly $81,000. They
Okay,
would
so
expect more from that walkout level in terms of their valuation than $81,000. They would see more like several $100,000 of value for a 1,500 square foot walkout. And that's
Okay.
what data is showing as well, is that these houses are selling for roughly $1 million more than what they're being assessed for. And so the assessment, when you look at the calculation, says it's clear if you're going to assess that level as $81,000, then you're going to get a wrong answer relative to the market, because the market's not going to accept $81,000 for that level.
Oh, okay. So in both statements, you're ultimately trying to say, I believe the value of walkouts is underassessed.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Now I noticed, moving back to Appendix 3, so you made adjustments to the actual sale prices per month, located in the middle of the page on Appendix 3, the first page there. It looks like you're using 1% per month. Is that correct?
Yeah, 12% is what I was going for. That's what I had seen previously. I think last year when my assessment was challenged, my inflation rate at that time was 12%. I mean, I can certainly change those numbers if you want to, really understand, if I'm getting it right or wrong. But I'm applying the same parameters to all the sales. So I think 12% might be on the low side. But
Well,
I don't.
12% annually, 1% per month. Is that just looking for clarification on that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So all of your sales data was used in this analysis on Appendix 3, which results in a median ratio for the walkouts lower than properties without walkouts. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So hypothetically, if there were indicators or observations that were left out that were greater than that median ratio, say over 1.00, if those indicators were put back into the analysis, that would ultimately increase the median ratio. Is that right? Is that a fair statement?
If you could let me know what I excluded.
Sure. I wonder if I could take you just above the basis date. You'll see there ratios removed if after the date and ratios removed if before the date. Do you see that, ma'am?
Is that on the ratio study? I don't have
So
it in front.
that's on Appendix 3. We're on the same page. Appendix 3, horizontal equity, page 1.
Yeah, so I know what you're talking about. Yeah. What's your question?
Okay, sure. So it looks like you've removed all indicators that occurred before January 1st, 2021. That's correct?
Yeah, if that's what it says, that's what I put into the system, because I think in previous discussions at the board, there was a request to not include stuff further back. And so I excluded it. I ran it with it. It didn't change anything though. I've tried it all the way back to 2016. I've done it for just 2 years. I've run it many different ways. So I would say there's nothing that I know of in the data that's being excluded that would bias it in either direction.
Okay, I wonder if I could take you to Appendix 2, page 2.
Okay. Is that my data?
That would be your data, yes.
Raw data? Let me go grab a printout of it so I don't have to switch screens. I have it in the other room. Hold on. I don't have a very good printer here at the cottage, and so I didn't reprint it, so I might have pages not quite right. Okay, yes. Page 2.
Yeah, you have it there, okay?
What's the roll number?
Could
I'm
I,
looking
could I
Say,
interrupt for just a very quick second, please? To the clerk, the evidence that's provided to the board is the same as the evidence provided to the respondent complainant? So the pages are numbered at the top, is that correct? I'm looking at, for example, roll on the left-hand side, it's got respondent disclosure R1. On the right-hand side, it's got disclosure package page X of 2, whatever. Okay, is it possible, Mr. Wayloggy and Ms. Blazo, for you to refer to those page numbers as opposed to appendix this or appendix that?
I'd love to, Chair. I don't know if I have a copy with the page numbers noted as you mentioned there. I'll just check with my colleague to see if.
Yes, if you could, please.
Yeah, and just for clarification, we never received the final complainant's evidence package with page numbers on it.
Okay,
So the information that we have was sent in 5 different pieces.
okay.
So if I go to my email and open up whatever document we're referring to, it'll have the numbers on it that you guys see. And if I do that, then we'll be on the same page.
Okay. I may have to ask more specifics when we come to things. I don't know if the other board members are having that issue, but yeah, when you're referring to appendix this and that, and I don't have on my documents saying where it's appendix, it's problematic for me. But I think.
I wonder, Chair, if in taking the board to a specific page, maybe I'll try to maybe reference the top data on that page, so it might be easier
Yes.
to locate.
Yeah,
Does
that
that
would
work?
really help.
Okay, so I'm in what I believe to be Appendix 2, which is essentially the complainant's data. So you would see the Appendix 2 has all the roll numbers, the neighborhood, the address, sale prices, the time adjusted sale prices, assessment, etc.
Okay. Okay,
So this would be the sales data that the complainant used in our analysis.
okay, I think I've got it.
Everybody there? Yeah. So I'm looking on the second page, Chair.
Which starts
And,
out with lower silver tip 14148?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
thank you.
And I would say towards the middle top of the page, there is roll number 13425 from Cougar Creek, 329 Canyon Close.
Yes, see that?
And the question for the complainant previously, as a quick summary, she mentioned that she didn't know if there was any observations out there that would impact the study if they were added back in. Just to the complainant, this property would have been excluded from your analysis because it was sold in July of 2020. Is that correct?
You know, I'm having trouble seeing it. Can you give me the roll number again? I got my printout so small.
Sure. 13425.
Let me just switch screens here for a second. I'll just look it up. Um, 13425. What was the address?
329 Canyon Close.
Yeah, yes.
You got it? Okay. So this, if you scroll all the way to the end of the page, it sold July 24th, 2020.
Mhm.
So you would have excluded this indicator from your analysis, correct? Because it was before January 1st, 2021.
Yep. But as I
And
said, I have run it with the, like, many different ways, and I can run it for you many other ways if you want.
Just
Um,
clarification.
So, yeah.
Okay. So this is a walkout sale, correct?
Yeah, it said it was a bungalow, but when I looked at it, it had a walkout level.
Okay. And if you scroll a little farther to the left, the assessment to sale ratio is calculated by yourself is 107. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm guessing if you removed the filter and included the sale back in, given that the ratio is over 1, that would obviously increase the median ratio, correct?
If you look at the data, let me just have another look here. Hold on. How would it impact? This is why I use stats, right, to see if the amount of data that I had was statistically relevant. And so if I look at the one that you're talking about that compares walkouts, none. And if I added that one in, I would add one more data point on 58. So yes, but then we would have to look at all the other ones that I excluded on the other end that would also have an impact. So, picking out just one data point, unless you have, sorry, I should ask, do you have like a table of data that you think that I excluded that's changing the result? Or
Well, I'm
misleading?
just asking for clarification on your material. That's all I'm looking for. So you excluded the sale, right?
Mhm.
And the ratio was 1.07. Okay.
Yeah.
If we go further down the page to roll number 17560, that's 104 Cafaro Court. Same exercise, ma'am. May 2020 is when the sale date was. It's a walkout and it has a ratio of 1.01. You excluded this sale, correct?
Because of the date, yeah. But I have run it with that in, and it doesn't statistically change the results. So, I mean, I can do it that way. If you'd like me to change the start date, I can certainly do that.
Well, I think you confirmed for me earlier that if you put these ratios back in, because both of these would be over 1, it would increase the median ratio, no?
Yeah, by 0.000. And what else would I have to include that reinforces from the other perspectives? So I don't know if you can just pick one or two of these and say it turns it into a flawed study. That's why it's a statistically relevant study with all the tests that are needed to make sure that it's not just something random we're seeing. And going back to find, and quite frankly, a $1.2 million home, well, I won't get into that.
That's fine.
Statistically, the study is
Move on.
solved.
Yeah, I'm going to move on. If we can go to the next page, I would say middle top of the page, I'm looking at roll number 17877, silver tip, 500 silver tip point. You see that?
Mm-hmm.
Same exercise, ma'am. This sold in November of 2020. It's a walkout and it has a ratio of 1.16. You excluded this, correct?
Yes. Only because of the date. Like, do you want me to go through and sort this and find all the ones that I excluded that I don't know. Okay, go ahead.
Looking for
Keep
information,
asking
just looking for clarification. Two sales down, so 21818 Stewart Creek, 438 Stewart Creek Close. Same exercise, ma'am. Sold October of 2020.
All right, excuse me, can you stop calling me ma'am?
Sure. What can I call you? Complainant?
Adrian?
Sure, I can do that.
Okay, thank you.
Adrian, if we look all the way to the right, October 2020, it's a walkout with a ratio of 1.03. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And you would have excluded this sale as well.
Just because of the date. But as I said, I included it in other versions, and it's statistically, there are exceptions. Like, as you know, there are exceptions that we can't always understand from a market point of view. But we pick a window, we validate the sales the best that we can by looking at them and looking at their reasonableness. And this one was only excluded by date.
I'll carry on. So page 6, Adrian, if I can take you to page 6.
Do you want me to sort the data and make you a table of the stuff that's excluded? Because this is going to get tiresome.
No, ma'am, I don't want you to do that. I'm just looking for clarification on what you've presented to the board. That's it. Just looking for clarification. On page 6, towards the top of the page, roll number 17470, lower Three Sisters. That's 112 Prizan Bay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that, Adrian?
Oh, I know
Same
it.
exercise, sold October 2020. It's a walkout. It has a ratio of 1.08. Is that correct? And you would have excluded it.
Yes. Okay. So I think I can provide some clarity here. How much was that sold for?
This property sold for $1,225,000.
Yeah, so that's the problem is when you start looking at walkouts that are below a certain value, that's where the vertical bias comes in. So you might find, I have in my data set a lot of that data as well in the valid data set or in the window that we're looking at. And what you find is the more expensive the house, the more extravagant the walkout. And so you are seeing, I was seeing a lot, and I was like questioning myself as well. I was seeing a lot of data at 100, 112%. And that's because of the vertical bias within the walkout category. The same types of ratios exist for ones without walkout, especially in that price range. Like I was saying at the beginning, if you paid around $1 million for your house, $1.2 million, you're probably going to be assessed pretty close to what it's worth. If you're getting up into the higher range, you could be at 48%. Like there's a listing that went up yesterday or last week. It's assessed for 2.4, and it says for 2.4, and it's listed for 5.8. Like there's something broken.
I do have one more, but I think I've made my point. Adrian, what I'd like to summarize for you and ask you is that there are a handful and a bit more of indicators within your data set that you've excluded from your analysis when trying to determine whether the walkouts are under-assessed or not. And all of these indicators, as we've demonstrated
Mr.
here,
Wayloggy?
over 1 point.
Mr. Wayloggy?
Yes. Am I talking too low?
This is the question period, not.
Yes, I'm getting there. I'm getting there, Chair.
All right, thank you. Were there any further
Straight
questions?
to the point, all of these indicators that you've excluded, if they were included back into the analysis, as you mentioned, they would increase the median ratio. Is that correct?
Not in a statistically relevant way, no.
And the date on which you've selected to exclude indicators, that you mentioned that was arbitrarily selected? Like that was a date set by you?
Yeah, I can set it any date I want, really. It's just a program. I set it that way because when I got I think I redid it actually, didn't I? I think I had to redo it because you got what I was told was I couldn't include sales past a certain date because they were too old and not relevant, and you couldn't include sales after July 1st, 2023. And so it's not really random. It's just I picked it specifically to meet the requirements of the evidence that we are allowed to submit to the board.
I'm going to move on. You mentioned that you identified some regressivity in the assessments, and if we're still on Appendix 3, I'm looking to take the board to page 8 on Appendix 3, and this would be a series of scatter plots, Mr. Chairman, and the top label of the scatter plots says ratio versus sale price scatter plots.
Sorry, could you repeat that, sir?
Ratio versus sale price scatter plots. There's a series of 3 graphs. And on my copy, I'm not sure if it's the same with yours, but it's on page 8 of Appendix 3.
Okay, I gotta open it up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. You got that.
I need
Okay.
1 second to look it up. Hold on.
Go ahead.
Oh, you can ask the question. I'll just open it up while you're talking.
Okay. So you mentioned that you found or discovered some regressivity in the assessment model, which would ultimately underassess high-valued properties. And I suspect these 3 graphs, this is what you're trying to support that claim with. Is that correct?
This one specifically was to address horizontal inequities rather than the vertical inequities. However, the horizontal inequities, as we just discussed, are more prominent the higher the value of the home. So it demonstrates both horizontal and vertical equity, but it wasn't the whole, that wasn't the test that was being applied there. Was to really look at the horizontal, but both are apparent, as you can
Sure.
see.
Yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, right? I would call that assessment regressivity. Is that ultimately what? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, but
Yeah. Okay.
is that it's okay?
Yeah. Now I wonder if you're aware that you ran these graphs using sale price as the independent variable.
Yes.
Okay. If you were to undertake an assessment regressivity bias analysis, are you aware that you should be running this as the assessment, using the assessment as the independent variable? Are you aware of this, Adrian?
I've seen it both ways. I mean, I can look it up in the book here because I did try and follow the guide on how to do it. Typically, I would suggest that. So what you're saying is you should use the assessed value as the parameter to run it against.
On the x-axis as the independent variable. If you're trying to analyze whether the
Yeah.
regressive as the value increases, you would typically use the assessment. Just wondering if that was an error or.
Not really an error, I don't think. I mean, I'm not sure what the outcome would be, especially when. So if I think about that, if I put the assessment on the x-axis and the assessment is, say, for example, one of the ones that was extreme, say the example was the one that I just mentioned, say 6 million and it's assessed for 3 million. It would show that point at 3 million being assessed at 50% rather than showing it where it's the actual value at 6 million being assessed at 50. And I don't think it would tell you the right answer. I think it would mislead you because it's the market value that's the known parameter, and the assessed value is what we're trying to replicate with the model. So assuming that assessed value is the x-axis, I don't think is correct. I mean, I can read it again in the book, but I thought that was the case.
Would you not use the variable that you're trying to analyze within the analysis itself? The assessment doesn't show up anywhere in that analysis. So how can you make the claim that the assessments, this shows that the assessment is regressive in nature if the assessment isn't in the analysis?
So the assessment is in the analysis, obviously, because we're talking about assessment to sales ratio, ASR. ASRs are the fundamental number that you plot. Now, whether I plot it against the assessed value or the market value, I think it's more correct to put it against the known figure than the assessed figure, because what we're trying to do is see how is the assessment compared to what's happening in the market, not how is the assessment compared to itself.
I think I'll move on. If I could turn to the page, which at the top of the page, it says ARB complainant submission 2024.
Sorry, where?
To the page that has a title ARB complainant submission 2024. Right below that, you'll see basis for claim.
Oh, yeah. Okay, the first page. Okay.
The first page, yes. Now I want to go, ironically, I want to go all the way to the last page. It would be page 9 for me, but at the top of the page, it says request.
Okay. Yes.
I'll wait a few minutes for the board. I think they're still
Oh, okay. All right.
trying to load it there.
Page 9 of 44, yeah.
Okay. So I just want to confirm, Adrian, the method in which you've come to your requested assessment. So you've time adjusted your own sale price to $2,223,930. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then if I take you back a few pages, sorry for jumping around, it would be page 3. I believe that you've derived an assessment level off of the average of these 13 sales, and you're using that 77% to multiply your time adjusted sale price to give us what you're recommending to the board. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to check with the board that they followed that.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what I did was I took all those sales and I escalated them to the same date with the same escalation rate. I calculated then the ASR for the properties that were not mine, which was 77%. And I said, okay, if that's how those are properties are valued relative to the market price, I would like to be valued relative to the market price at the same position.
Okay.
Alternatively, on my resubmission after receiving your feedback to exclude some of those, you can see that I found another set of properties in Lions Park area and just said, essentially use that data to assess my property, which would cost it similarly, and then apply 150% market adjustment and come up with pretty much the same number as what I did in the initial submission. So I just kind of went at it two ways.
Okay. And I suspect that that last part you're referencing information in your rebuttal.
Yes.
Okay. I'll focus on these 13 sales here for now. Okay. So to simplify things for the board, basically your request can be simplified to these 13 sales right here. You're ultimately using these 13 sales to derive an ASR, which you're applying to your time adjusted sale price.
Yeah. And I picked them because, well, they're available sales data, and also they either had the same sale price or assessment price, I think. It's been a bit. Yeah.
Okay. Nope, that's fine. I noticed the very last sale in your chart here. This is from South Canmore. That's 618 4th Street.
Mm-hmm.
So you would agree that using sales within your direct location or market area is a reasonable approach?
Well, I think that the hard lines between, say, Lions Park and South Canmore, um, I, I think I can't completely agree with that being a hard line. And I think what would be more productive now, because you asked me to exclude these sales, and so I rebutted and gave you new data. So we can spend time on this chart. But again, I've responded to your concerns and I found other sales.
Okay, so you're ultimately saying you don't want the board to consider any evidence within your initial response and then just go to the rebuttal, or?
No, of course not. Sorry. I just said I found more compelling, easier to digest information after you asked that. So feel free to ask me questions about the ones in the table.
Just real simple though, you would agree with using comparable sales within your market location? That would seem like a reasonable approach, as you've done here.
I think I answered that. I think I answered that. And the problem I have with that is that many of the properties that have been provided by Benchmark have the same error. So it's an impossible problem to solve if I bound myself in the area where the market factors 270% to 380% and not look at the ones 500 meters down the road. So I have to disagree that that's the way to do it.
So ultimately, looking at the most comparable properties or properties with the most comparable location and physical characteristics would not be your main criteria to select comparable sales. Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I would select properties that have exactly similar locations relative to downtown and configurations, but I have to exclude the South Canmore area because there's a error that I've demonstrated in the model. So, I mean, I'm happy to include those similarities, but also at the same time, we have to be able to say it makes sense that yes, the market is moving in the same direction for all of us, but it doesn't appear to be doing that in some areas, and mine is going up very fast and others aren't. So I can't agree with you.
That's okay. That's okay. I have just a few more questions, if you'll bear with me. So you mentioned that the adjustments that you've made for time or market conditions, as we would call it, they're based on the MLS date, correct? Not the transfer date?
Yes.
And
I think I reran it for you guys in the rebuttal and it didn't change the answer. So I put in so yes, I used that initially. And then when you pointed out to me, you had to use something different. Again, okay. I used these new numbers and it didn't change anything.
Okay, so you are aware that the assessments were prepared using the transfer date and not the MLS date. That's yes. What I'm. Okay, and I suppose.
Wait. Sorry, I reran them. So yes, the first one was, and then I adjusted them based on your feedback and got the same answer.
Well, I highly doubt that, ma'am. But let's just go back here for a sec.
Sorry, is there a question there? What's the question?
Yeah, you got to let me ask it.
So you said you doubted something about what I said. So what is it?
I can disagree with you, ma'am. Or Adrian, apologies. So you mentioned that all of these sales are adjusted based on the MLS date, and you're aware that all of the assessments use the transfer date. My question to you is, if your entire position is that you do not want to see inequity within the assessments in Canmore, do you think it's appropriate that you're requesting a requested assessment based on information as of an MLS date when everybody else has their assessment prepared using the transfer date? Is that not inequitable?
I think it's irrelevant. I don't know if I think 87 days is the average difference between the MLS date and the the date of transfer. The transfer date was always accepted, and and for the majority of history of the processes, they were so close together that wasn't even an issue. And then, of course, the pandemic hits, and now we're like, okay, do we want all the assessors to change their processes in order to adjust for, on average, 87 days? 87 days in a time adjusted 12% is almost, it's negligible, and it also applies to all of the properties. So I did, as I said, I did adjust that in the second run, adjusting with the numbers that you gave me, as well as the 87 days for every property similarly, that impacted those, starting in 2021 when the problem started. And then I stopped it when I found the evidence that the Alberta government had announced that they were up to date. So I adjusted only for that period.
Thank you, Chair. I believe that's all the questions we have.
Okay, thank you. From the panel, is there any questions from the panel?
I've got a question. So, Ms. Blazo, I see in your package on your application form, you requested a reduction to $1.6 million for your assessed value. And then in the conclusion page, you've asked for an adjustment down to 1.712.
Yeah. Well,
1,426. So which
Yep.
is your request?
my request is the most recent one. So I made the initial request before I had the data and was able to do the analysis. So I was going based on my theory of what I was going to learn. And I think I was pretty close, but the number, if I do it, sort of mathematically by the book, it is 1.7. And I'm happy with that.
Okay, so on page 9 of 44 in our packages, that's the amount that you're requesting. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Ms. Mara, did you have any questions?
No, that's, I'm sorry. Not at this time, thank you. I was going to inquire about the same.
Okay.
Good, thank you.
Ms. Blazo, if I can take you to the spreadsheet that had the 10 properties, and it's titled, it's at the top, it says, please find attached my complaint form. I believe it's page 3 of the, it was attached to the
Yep.
actual formal complaint form.
Yeah. Let me just have a quick look.
Yeah, see one, it shows 10 properties in total, which includes your own. The column on the far left says, where am I here? Well, it lists neighborhood, and then right below that it says lot sizes and location. And then the neighborhood for the 9 properties that aren't yours are listed as less desired or same. And I guess my first question is can you give a little more explanation of that, what you mean by less desired?
Sorry, I don't see that. So what page is it on on my page numbers?
It doesn't have a page number. Well, it's complaint form. It's page 3 of 3 from your complaint form. It says at the top. It says,
Oh, that's I submitted that in April to start the complaint. I actually don't have that in front of me. I have like sort of my more formal stuff. So can you ask your question again? I probably can answer it. Just let me know, just ask it again and I'll think about it from that perspective. I'm
Okay.
sure I can.
For the 9 properties, and your property is the very first one listed on this, 633 2nd Street. And under the title of the row, it says neighborhood. And for yours, it says SOCAN, which presumably is South Canmore. For the other 9 properties, it says less desired or same.
Yeah, so basically, depending on the neighborhood that it's in, it might be assessed lower because it's in, you know, I don't know, benchlands because it's farther from downtown, or, you know, I don't know, TP Town maybe wouldn't be as valuable. So I was really just trying to mirror sort of how when I get the table from Benchmark, they try and they give you an idea of how should I be thinking about this property relative to my own. And so I kind of think South Canmore is a great place. And so they're either the same or less desirable because I don't think there's, you know, it's just my opinion. And maybe it's validated by Benchmark as well. I don't know if you have an opinion on what my assessments were of those neighborhoods.
Okay, because the next row down says lot size and location. And for your property, it says average.
Yeah.
For 8 of the 9 remaining properties, it says far superior.
Oh, yeah. So what's happening there is, you know, so my property is an average property. It's got a big 3-story house behind it. So the view's gone. And when I look at the other properties, and the lot is a certain size. So it's really about the lot. Like once you're in a neighborhood and maybe it's less desirable or more desirable, but once you're in the neighborhood and you look at the lot compared to my lot, if it had a larger, you know, maybe it was, you know, twice the size and had unobstructed views, I'd say, yeah, that's a lot better than what I got. So that's what that column meant.
Okay. Complainant disclosure C2 on your page 5. And this is the one with the figure 2 assessment increases by neighborhood, the chart at the top with the percentages, kind of a map of Canmore.
Yeah.
In the verbiage that's below that figure 2, there's a line that reads, also, given its materiality, it would have been communicated to the ARB. And you're saying a change in treatment. Can you explain
Yes.
why you think it would have been communicated to the ARB?
Well, maybe not the ARB, but definitely town council. Because so if you were to say, you know, 4 years ago, 3 years ago, we had assessments and they were all fair, and the market is moving the way it is, and everybody's getting annual tax increases relatively the same, then I wouldn't see any problems. But so you have to either believe it was broken before and we're trying to fix it, or it's broken now and it was okay before. Because if you're increasing someone's taxes by only 2% and someone's taxes by 76% over a certain time frame, something was either broken before or is broken now. And something that big would have to be disclosed because it's material and because it's kind of part of the purview of what you guys are looking at all the time. I would expect that you would have been notified that there's a problem in the model 3 years ago, and that we were doing things to fix it.
Okay. On the next page, page 6, and this is in your evidence, but it's more or less a question for the respondents. You have table 4, horizontal equity test, and it lists the test name as being the Kruskal-Wallis rank test, the ANOVA F test, Welch's test, and throughout your document, there's references to other such things. And the question I have for Mr. Wayloggy is, do you recognize those tests? Are they part of your process? Not just those ones, but the other ones mentioned elsewhere in the documents?
I recognize these tests, Chair. I would say for our current processes, these type of tests are not conducted. But we do have material that in our response package that speaks to horizontal and vertical assessment levels as per the annual audit report. So we'll touch on that a little later.
Okay. So Ms. Blazo, both you and the respondent referred to the International Association of Assessing Officers. I presume these sorts of tests came from the IAAO?
Yes, they do. That's how we test for these subgroups. So yeah, that's where I learned about them. And they're really, really simple. Like the Kruskal-Wallis test, you just basically order everything by ASR, label it 1 to 100, like sequentially, and then put it back into the buckets and total them up and see if each bucket should have roughly the same number of values. So it's complicated in some ways to get it, the pluses and the minuses right, but it really is just looking at how many houses are in the blockout level have a low whether their ASR is relative to the other ones. So it's a pretty common test.
But in preparing all of these data and all this information, things like that, did you confirm with either Benchmark or Alberta Municipal Affairs or the Property Rights Tribunal that these are accepted practices or accepted tests used to devise assessments in this province? In other words, is there something here that's new that's not used in Alberta that's being proposed by yourself?
No, there's nothing new that wouldn't be considered in Alberta as relevant as far as I know. Maybe Lance, if I don't.
I just want to make one point. So these are just statistical tests, Chair, and this is done after assessments are prepared, right? So these particular tests are not used in the process to prepare assessments. They're just one of many tests that one can undertake in analyzing the data afterward.
Okay, so these cannot be used, well, how can I put this? These might not be a proof that the assessment was done incorrectly.
We wouldn't take issue with the tests themselves, Chair. We're taking issue with, essentially, as you'll see in our response, the data that was used. And, well, of course, I'll get into it in our response, but we're not taking issue with these tests by themselves. We're taking issue with how the complainant came up with the position that the assessments are regressive in nature, that certain characteristics such as walkouts are under-assessed. We believe the analysis that she undertakes is flawed and ultimately leads to false conclusions. But that's getting into my response, so I'll
Okay.
hold off.
All right, thank you very much. I don't have any further questions, and the panel, you're good? Very good. Yes, Mr. Rayalagi, it's your opportunity to provide the respondent's evidence.
Thank you, Chair. Very much appreciated. As I mentioned earlier, I am a bit of a low talker, so please just interject if you can't hear me at any point. Just chime in and ask me to speak up. I'm not offended. I will start with a page that's labeled "Response to Complainants, Appendix 1 through 4." Chair, is that page number 1 for you guys?
Just having a look. Yes. Yep, that's the title page to your document.
Okay, so just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm going to present this portion of the response, labeled "Response to the Complainants, Appendix 1, 2, 3, and 4." and then I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Ms. Bannerman. She's going to present the other half of the response. So I'll go ahead and start our response, and I'll have the board turn to page 3. And this would be the summary of testimonial evidence.
Yes. Thank you.
So overall, Mr. Chairman, I just want to provide the board with a bit of a summary and a roadmap for this particular response to the complainant. As we've heard from the complainant, she's undertaken, essentially, it's an individual audit of the assessments, and she's ultimately concluded in her opinion that there are elements of the assessment that are regressive in nature. Our response to all that she's prepared and concluded in Appendix 1, 2, 3, and 4, we've taken 4 issues, which I will specifically zero in on why we believe everything that she's done in Appendix 1 to 4 is ultimately flawed and leads to what I would call false conclusions. And I won't get into it just yet, but these 4 areas that I want to focus on, Chair, the first being that the complainant is using the MLS date versus the assessor that's using the transfer date. The second is the complainant is using what we would call post facto or hindsight sales. So these are sales that are after the valuation date. Ultimately, the assessor is not allowed to use those sales. The third issue is the complainant is not using a complete data set. She's only looking at MLS sales, whereas the assessor has to use both MLS and non-MLS sales, or private sales as we call them. And issue number 4 is you'll see that in her data set, 379 sales, there's a significant number of sales under the feature that's labeled lower level, which is just simply unknown to the complainant. And ultimately, it just brings in the question on whether there's validity in the analysis and the conclusion if it's missing such a significant portion of the data elements on which the complainant is trying to analyze. So I'll get into those just shortly, but I do want to say we are going to wrap it up. I made mention, Chair, earlier that there are vertical and horizontal tests, as well as bias tests that are undertaken in the annual process, the annual audit process. So we have included some materials from our annual audit to demonstrate to the board that yes, in fact, the assessment as prepared meets all regulated standards, as well as the non-regulated standards with respect to price-related differential, which is a bias test. So with that, Chair, I'd like to start in on my page 5, and this is issue number 1, sale date versus the transfer date. So as we've explored through questioning, the complainant confirmed that all of the sales that she used in her analysis were based on the MLS date and not the transfer date. Now, why this is important, the complainant alluded to this earlier, but over the analysis period, so that is 3 years prior to the valuation date, over the analysis period, COVID hit. There was I would say there was a bit of a stop at Alberta Land Titles, and land title documents were not being processed efficiently. And we saw transfers after MLS dates exceeding 6 months, 7 months. I have a material clip in here which says even into 2023, Chair, the MLS dates and the transfer dates were still 4 months away from each other. Now, historically, this may not actually be an issue if this was 5 or 10 years ago, but because COVID hit right in the middle of this, and because this difference is so significant, it's important because if you use the MLS date, you are 100% going to get different results than using the transfer date. We've heard from the complainant that she adjusted 1% per month, and if your transfers 6, 7, 8 months after the MLS date, what you're doing is you're ultimately increasing or adjusting an extra 6, 7, 8%, depending on the observation, higher than what you should be doing using the transfer date, which is ultimately what the assessor has to use. So what this has done and why this is important is that it's led to overinflated adjusted sale prices and artificially low ASRs. And this, in part, Chair, this in part has led to some of the regressivity conclusions that the complainant is seeing, is because she's just using the wrong date. And personally, I don't accept the idea that a 6 month, 7 month, 8 month gap and 6, 7, 8% adjustments is a non-issue. As the complainant said, she reran the numbers and it doesn't make any difference. I don't accept that. 6, 7, and 8% differences just on individual indicators will absolutely have an impact overall. And on my page 5, what I've done is I've included 5 examples of this, Mr. Chair. You'll see all 5 of these sales transferred 180 days, 190 days, 224 days, 182 days, 171 days. I've summed it up on the bottom of page 6, but overall, this is just a small sampling of the issues that surround the difference between MLS date and transfer date. Moving on to page 7, this is, as I said, Mr. Chair, this is just an excerpt from the Alberta Chamber of Commerce, and this just supports the fact that still in 2023, early in 2023, the Alberta Chamber of Commerce was recommending to the government of Alberta that they ultimately put resources into fixing this issue, because they were still seeing titles transferring 4 months after. So there were still 4-month delays early into 2023 as well. On my page 8, this is an excerpt. This is an assessment bulletin 22-01. This is from the government of Alberta, Municipal Affairs. I would draw the board's attention to the middle of the page, establishing a sale date. A standard for sale date is necessary to ensure consistent application across the province. Therefore, the C of T registration date should continue to be the starting point for establishing a sale date for a property. So again, Mr. Chair, this bulletin was sent out to all assessors province-wide. It was reaffirmed by the government. All assessors, for consistency purposes, have to use the transfer date. That's the C of T date registered on title. And on page 9, again, reaffirming this point, this is an excerpt from the 2023 Recording and Reporting Information for Assessment Audit and Equalized Assessment Manual. Middle of the page, spikes in economic activity and rapid changes in property values are often short-term and localized. As such, assessors should continue to use the C of T registration date as the starting point for establishing a property sale date and for making adjustments for price since the time of sale. And I repeat, for making adjustments for price since the time of sale. The C of T is the most reliable, most readily available date for all property transactions in Alberta. I'm just going to carry on a little bit more. Information from alternate sale date sources may be limited, may be unaffordable for some assessors, and is not always efficiently obtainable. For example, assessors should not rely on MLS data as a definitive source for sale date. Why? Well, the data is not available in all areas. Where it is available, the MLS data does not encompass transactions for all type of property, and the variance in time between MLS date and the C of T registration date constantly fluctuates. So again, for this just reaffirms that the assessor is required to use the transfer dates to prepare assessments. If the complainant conducts an independent audit as she's done, and she uses the MLS date, she's going to get different results because she's not using the rules that the assessor is bound to do, and that is using the transfer date. On page 10, this is just an excerpt from a recent board decision. We've provided a number of board decisions. This is from Trican Well Services. in the county of Grand Prairie. Ultimately, Chair, the board decided that yes, the registration date, that transfer date, that is the date that should be used when preparing assessments as the sale date. How's the volume level? Too loud, too soft?
No, it's fine. It's good.
Moving on to page 11, this is issue 2 with the complainant's analysis. This is the transfer date parameters. As I mentioned earlier, the assessor cannot use any sale after the valuation date. We call this post facto or hindsight information. All sales data that's used to prepare assessment is 3 years prior to the valuation date. I've itemized per page how many of the sales that the complainant included in her analysis actually exceeded the valuation date. It's roughly about 7%, which is a significant portion. All of these sales would not be available to the assessor when preparing the assessment. So you're looking at 2 different data sets. You're looking at the complainant who's using sales that ultimately the assessor can't. And I've provided two egregious examples of this. There are 2 sales at the very end of the sales data that the complainant put forth to the board. Both of these sales occurred in September of 2024. That's 6 months after the assessor prepared and sent the assessment notice. There is no way that an assessor could include 2 sales that would not happen until 6 months after the preparation of the assessment and sending of the assessment notice. It's just nonsensical. Again, a few board decisions that also touch on this for the board's direction. Trican Well Services as well as Beta Management both confirmed that there are very, very unique circumstances where the board would actually consider a post facto or a hindsight sale. It basically reaffirms that any sale outside of the valuation parameters, which would be that after the valuation date, the board typically would not use in determining whether an assessment was fair and equitable. Moving on to page 13, this is issue number 3. So as I mentioned earlier, the assessor is required to use all arm's length good transactions when preparing assessments. It doesn't matter if it's an MLS sale or a private sale, the assessor is required to use all sales. The complainant conducted the independent analysis only using MLS sales. So the complainant's only using a partial data set in her analysis. So all of the conclusions that she ultimately draws on and takes the position of, it only includes a part of the assessment data that the assessor used in preparing the assessment. So this is shown on the bottom of page 13. You'll see I've highlighted in a box. These are all 4 categories, all 4 value ranges for single family dwellings. This of course comes off the annual audit ratio study. As you can see, all of the single family dwellings that were used added up to 479 indicators. That's 479 indicators. When you compare that to the complainant, the total amount of indicators that she provided was 379. Of course, some of these are post facto, so they obviously wouldn't be included. So you're looking at over 100 indicators that the assessor had to prepare the assessments that the complainant didn't when conducting her individual audit. Moving on to page 14, the 4th issue that we've noticed with the analysis is the unknown data. So the complainant spent some time on whether walkout properties are underassessed or whether certain locations are underassessed. And with respect to the walkouts, there was over 20% of the information contained in the 379 sales which didn't identify any information. So the information was unknown. Essentially, it was unavailable to be analyzed. So you're talking about 79 sales that really couldn't be used. I believe the complainant said they were excluded at the end of the day from her analysis of walkouts because the data was unknown. Again, Mr. Chair, members of the board, this just brings into question the validity, the results, and the conclusions that the complainant has put forth. We just believe that the analysis that was undertaken was quite flawed because it was quite a bit different than the data set and the analysis that the assessor would use. And with that said, Mr. Chair, it's not the job of any individual to undertake an analysis such as this to audit the assessments of a municipality. And the reason being is that every year the assessor is audited on an annual basis. Obviously, the assessor has to comply with regulated standards as per the regulations. But also, periodically, there are auditors that conduct a detailed audit. And a detailed audit was conducted not too long ago in the town of Canmore, in addition to every annual audit. So there's a whole department in municipal affairs, the government of Alberta, where all of the individuals there spend all of their time auditing the assessors that prepare assessments in Alberta. So there's already an audit function in place. And the great strength of that, Mr. Chair, is that the data that the assessor uses to prepare the assessment is the same data that is used for the auditor to audit the assessment. They have all the information because we hand it over to them. They conduct their audit. And obviously on an annual basis, you'll see annual audit ratio study reports as are included on page 16. So on the bottom of page 16, I made mention for any value range, the regulated standard is that the assessor must be between 0.95 and 1.05. As you'll see, the median assessment for all value ranges for single family dwellings comply with this standard. In fact, they're actually a little bit on the low side, Mr. Chair, 0.962, 0.961, 0.952, 0.952. But all pretty close to each other as well with respect to assessment level. So all comply, all meet for all value ranges. In addition, every value range has to have a coefficient of dispersion. So that's the COD, labeled COD, has to be under 15. And as you'll see there, all the value ranges meet this. Value range 1, 9.7, 8.8, 8.8, 8.8. So these regulated standards have all been met. This is from the annual audit ratio report. Additionally, if we move on to page 17, I have an excerpt here speaking to assessment progressivity and assessment regressivity. So the statistic that audit uses, and it's a non-regulated standard, so the assessor doesn't have to comply with these, but they do provide these in their detailed audit. And it's through the statistic called price-related differential. And I'm reading just from, this is an excerpt from our detailed audit, November of 2020. The price-related differential, or PRD, is a non-regulated quality standard. PRD values between 0.98 and 1.03 indicate high and low value properties have assessments at similar percentages of market value. PRD values below 9.98 indicate there is a progressive bias favoring low value properties and that high value properties are overassessed. So essentially the PRD statistic is a representation or an indicator of whether the assessment is regressive or progressive. But as long as the PRD falls between 0.98 and 1.03, what that means, Mr. Chair, is that there is assessment uniformity. And if I can turn your attention to the page, to page 18, this is the top of page 18. You can see if we scan to the very right, the PRD for all value ranges meets the uniformity test that is being between 0.98 and 1.03 for all value ranges. So in conclusion, Chair, in conclusion, the complainant didn't need to undertake the audit function as she did through Appendix 1 through 4. In doing so, obviously, she may not know the rules, the regulations that the assessor has to follow when preparing assessments, and maybe she didn't know, but ultimately it resulted in essentially a significant difference in process. And I've identified all 4 of those reasons which we believe that her analysis is flawed and why the conclusions that she stated were false. And I do want to emphasize again the ASR, the COD, and the PRD statistics that are in the annual report and how they all meet the quality standards. With that said, Mr. Chair, I want to pass the presentation over to my colleague, Ms. Bannerman, and she's going to present the next portion of the evidence.
Okay, before we get started, I'm going to ask everybody if we're prepared to go on, or do we need a break? Everybody's okay? You're all right? Okay. Ms. Blazo, are you all right?
Oh, yeah.
And you ready to go? Okay, all right. Ms. Bannerman, proceed, please.
All right, thank you. So my portion of our submission is going to focus more on the individual assessment and our assessment process for producing the 2023 assessment for the subject property. So what we'll try to demonstrate to the board is that the onus is on the complainant to demonstrate that the assessment is incorrect, that the valuation standard for the subject property is market value, and that the assessor must prepare assessments in a fair and equitable manner. So the assessment of the subject property is fair and equitable based on a review of other assessments and sales of similar properties in town. When compared against the assessments and sales of other residential properties located in the same economic area as the subject property, it is clear that the subject property's assessment is both fair and equitable. So on pages 4 and 5, we have a picture of the subject property as well as aerial maps to show their location within the town. And I'm sorry, I'm referring to the page numbers on the bottom of our submission rather than probably the top numbers that were produced by the ARB. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, and so on page 6 of our submission, we have some of the general assessment information showing that the subject property is from the South Canmore neighborhood. It's an R1 residential detached property built in 1996 and renovated, so it has an effective year built of 2001. We also show that the subject property transferred through Alberta Land Titles on October 2nd, 2020, and the sale price adjusted to the July 1st, 2023 date is $2,358,600, whereas the assessment for this property is $2,215,000. So just to give a little bit of background on property assessments for the town of Canmore are prepared in accordance with the requirements under the Municipal Government Act and matters relating to assessment and taxation regulation. As previously stated by my colleague, all assessments are expected to meet quality standards as prescribed by the province in matters relating to assessment and taxation regulation. Alberta legislation prescribes that property assessments must be prepared based on market value. And market value means the amount that a property might be expected to realize if it is sold on the open market by a willing seller to a willing buyer. Property assessments for the 2023 assessment year must be an estimate of the value of the property on July 1st, 2023, which is our valuation date, and reflect the physical condition of the property on December 31st, 2023, which is our condition date. And now the legislation further stipulates that an assessment of property based on market value, A, must be prepared using mass appraisal, B, must be the estimate of the value of the fee simple state in the property, and C, must reflect typical market conditions for properties similar to that property. So mass appraisal is the legislated methodology used for valuing individual properties and involves the following process. Properties are stratified into groups of comparable properties. Common property characteristics are identified for the properties in each group, and then a uniform valuation model is created for each property group and then applied back to that property group. So on the bottom of page 8, we go through some of the different approaches to value. So the subject property has been prepared for the 2023 assessment using the market modified cost approach. The market modified cost approach is a hybrid of both the cost and the sales comparison approaches to value. Under this approach, all improvements are first valued based on the cost approach, and then the values are adjusted to reflect the current market conditions based on sale transactions. This is the most appropriate method of valuation because it mirrors the actions of buyers and sellers in the marketplace. And there is also sufficient sales data to derive reliable market estimates. So just further onto page 9, we received sales information from the Alberta Land Titles Office, and the sales are then validated. Validation may include site inspections, interviews with involved parties, a review of land title documents, corporate searches, and third-party information such as MLS. The resulting validated sales are used to develop valuation models to replicate market behavior. For the 2023 valuation of residential properties, sales occurring from July 1st, 2020 to June 30th, 2023 were analyzed. We have reviewed the sales occurring from this time frame for the 2023 valuation of residential properties. Time adjustments are applied to the sale prices to account for any market fluctuations occurring between the sale date and the legislated valuation date of July 1st, 2023. So now I'll just take you to page 11 of our submission, which is the calculation of the subject property. As mentioned, the market modified cost approach is used in the preparation of residential detached property assessments in the town of Canmore. This approach was applied to the subject property for the 2023 assessment to produce the assessed value of $2,215,000. The calculation is demonstrated on the residential ratepayer report, which is attached. So now I just want to mention post facto sales, and I believe Lance mentioned it in his presentation, but often a complainant will introduce evidence of a market or sales transaction that occurs after the July 1st valuation date to support its request for a change to the assessment. It's important to note that the use of a post facto sale or a sale that occurs after July 1st of the assessment year is restricted. The board may consider such post facto evidence to confirm market trends. However, post facto evidence cannot be used in setting value. And we've cited some decisions below to support this principle. The legislation also supports the view that post facto sales cannot be used in the valuation process. An assessment review board in its decision-making is required to take into consideration all of the standards and procedures outlined in the regulation. This requirement is found in section 467 sub 3 of the Municipal Government Act, where it states, an assessment review board must not alter any assessment that is fair and equitable, taking into consideration the valuation and other standards set out in the regulations and the procedures set out in the regulations. Again, we've provided some decisions, some summaries of some decisions there for you to review. So now on page 14 of my submission, I just want to talk a little bit about assessment quality standards. And I know Lance went into it quite a bit in his presentation, but I'd like to go just a little bit deeper just to help the board and Ms. Blazo understand some of the key concepts. So according to Alberta legislation, for an assessment to be considered accurate, the assessment to sales ratio for a given stratum of properties, so that would be properties that are similar in type, location, or use, must generally fall between 95 and 105%. This means that on average, assessments should closely reflect market values. However, this range allows for variations, acknowledging that perfect alignment with sales prices is not always possible due to the complexities of the real estate market. I've included below the quality standards from matters relating to assessment and taxation regulation, just showing where our legislated ranges have to fall. So while the goal for the stratum of properties as a whole is to have an ASR within the 95 to 105% range, not every individual property sale will necessarily fall within that range, and there's several reasons for this. The first being market fluctuations. So as we've seen in Canmore, the real estate market can change rapidly, and assessments that are typically based on market conditions at a specific point in time. So a sale happens during a particular strong or weak market might not align necessarily perfectly with the assessed value. There's also unique property features in some properties that aren't fully captured by the standard assessment model. For example, a home with a recent high-end renovation may sell for more than a typical property in the same grouping, while others might sell for less that may need repairs. There's also buyer and seller motivations. So price at which a property sells can be influenced by factors unrelated to its assessed value, such as the urgency to sell, if there's a bidding war, or personal circumstances of the buyer or seller. And then, of course, there's outliers. And some sales are just going to be outliers, meaning that they're not representative of the general market trends within the stratum. These could be properties that sold well above or below due to unusual circumstances. We see this a lot in the town of Canmore with property owners and some private sales where the property owners aren't aware of the current market conditions and end up selling their properties for less than what they could have received if it had been marketed on the open market. In addition to the requirement that the assessment to sales ratio for each stratum of properties falls between 95 to 105%, Alberta legislation also mandates that the coefficient of dispersion, it must be under 15% for residential properties. So this further ensures that assessments are fair and accurate while acknowledging that not all individual sales will fall in the 95 to 105% range. The coefficient of dispersion is crucial because it recognizes that while the average ASR in a property stratum should fall between this level, not every individual sale will align perfectly within this range. This allows for natural variations in property values within a group while ensuring that these variations remain within an acceptable limit of consistency. As submitted, and so the requirement measures the variability in assessments, and it's kept in check while still allowing for natural differences in property sales. And this is information that the auditors look at on an annual basis. If we were passing these high-level tests, then our assessment role would not be able to be declared, and we would not be able to send out assessment notices to our tax property owners. So as submitted previously by my colleague, the province's role is to audit the town's assessment methodology. And that's distinct from the role and function of the Assessment Review Board, which is essentially what the complainant is asking the board to do. Decisions previously submitted in our material clearly delineate the distinct roles between provincial audit requirements and the Assessment Review Board. As was demonstrated, the 2023 property assessments for the town of Canmore have met the provincially legislated assessment quality standards. So on page 16 of our material, I'm just going to go through and provide some information on the sales and the valuation of the property. As mentioned, market modified cost approach was utilized. We used the sales between July 1st, 2020 and June 30th, 2023, and these were analyzed and used in the preparation of the assessments. On this page are sales of the same quality of construction and finishing. They're all two-story, no basement, custom homes in the same neighborhood and with a similar location to the subject property. The subject property itself sold on October 2nd, 2020, which is within 3 years before the July 1st, 2023 valuation date. That sale is highlighted below as well, and it demonstrates the assessed value of the subject property is the assessment to sales ratio is 94% of the time adjusted sales price. The analysis on that page demonstrates that the assessment of the subject property is fair and equitable when compared against assessments and sales of other similar residential properties located in the same economic region. The residential ratepayer reports on pages 32 to 48 provide additional property characteristics. The following pages, we've provided a map just showing the close proximity of the comparables to the subject property. So now on page 18, I just want to respond to the comparables that were provided by the complainant. And these were comparables that were provided both on the complaint form and in the complainant's disclosure material. I also will respond to some of the new information that was provided in rebuttal, so some of the new sales information, but they generally follow the same. We haven't included any kind of formal chart for it because they fall under the same bundles as we've got here. So these properties are the sales referenced as the comparable properties to the subject property as provided by the complainant. The differences in the assessed values are attributable to differences in the property characteristics themselves. The following properties from the complaint form did not transfer recently on Alberta land titles and should be omitted from any analysis or comparison measure. So those are the properties at 825 14th Street, which last transferred in 2017, and 151 Rundle Crescent, which last transferred in 2003. So copies of the land title documents and the residential ratepayer reports can be found on pages 49 to 108 of our submission. The residential ratepayer reports will further support that aside from location, these properties are not similar to the subject property. So again, we have the first chart there. These are the following properties that transferred outside of the valuation date and should be omitted from any analysis or comparison measure. And then we talk about location. The next chart is all of the properties that are grouped that were not in a similar location to the subject property. And so the subject property is located in South Canmore neighborhood, and South Canmore is a highly desirable location and, in my opinion, the most desirable neighborhood in the town of Canmore. This neighborhood is bordered by the Bow River and Policeman's Creek, Canmore's Main Street to the north and Millennium Park to the south. It's centrally located within walking distance of Canmore's downtown. And this premium location has created what we would call a unique submarket within the town of Canmore, garnering higher sale prices than the remainder of the town. This is also evidenced by the vast redevelopment of properties in the neighborhood over the past several years. And there were sufficient sales of similar properties within the South Canmore neighborhood. And these properties from outside of that South Canmore market or submarket should be omitted from any analysis or comparison measure. And I just wanted to point out a couple additional pieces of information on some of the sales that were provided. So the property at 109 10 Walker was a new construction sale that transferred directly from the builder to the current owner. And it was purchased before it was completed. Please note also that the MLS sale date was in October 2022, and the property didn't actually transfer through Alberta land titles until August 2023, which was 10 months later. So just regarding the complainant's rebuttal information as well, just for ease in time later on, the 15 sales that were added through the rebuttal disclosure were also all outside of the South Canmore neighborhood and again lacked the comparability. So the only property that was brought forward by the complainant that is located in the South Canmore neighborhood is a property located at 618 4th Street. And the property information is provided on page 20. This property is not considered comparable to the subject property. This property is a 1980 built home with a much inferior quality of construction. This property is also zoned R2 versus the subject property, which is R1, which allows for the development of a duplex. The R2 zoning allows for the duplex. The improvement value on this property is minimal, with the majority of the value apportioned to the land, as this property will likely be demolished and redeveloped to its highest and best use as a duplex. And I'd like to point out that aside from the lack of comparability from the complainant's comparables, there are just as many properties in the town of Canmore where the property assessment to sales ratio would fall above 105%. The complainant in their disclosure has only focused on the properties where the assessment to sales ratios are below 100. In our analysis, we could have provided these high ASRs to support an increase in the assessment if we weren't considering all of the sales in town, or if we weren't considering actual comparability to the subject property. The sales that we provided in our submission are a good representation of the market value of the subject property. So just further down, I just want to highlight again that the onus to prove that an assessment is incorrect, it is the requirement of the complainant. This principle has been well established by the Court of King's Bench and adopted by assessment review boards, which I've included summaries of those decisions on page 22. In this case, the complainant has provided sales information for a small sample of properties located all throughout the town. These properties lack similarity in terms of location and property characteristics to be considered comparable to the subject property, and as such should not be considered by the board as justification to adjust the assessment for the subject property. With the exclusion of these properties that are not comparable to the subject property, the complainant has not met their onus in demonstrating that their assessment is incorrect, nor provided support for their requested assessed value. So not only is fairness and equity a fundamental objective to be met in preparing assessments, but it's also a specific test to be applied in deciding a complaint or an appeal. The preeminent status of equitable treatment is reinforced in Alberta legislation by preventing an assessment review board from altering an assessment that is fair and equitable when compared to the assessments of similar properties. In Alberta, the board is faced with a situation where there is a clear conflict between equity and market value, and one objective must be sacrificed at the expense of others. Market value should prevail. Again, we've provided decisions and summaries of decisions in our disclosure package. Properties also should not be used as equity comparables if they're not similar to the subject property. We've listed the decision for Tony Priza versus the City of Edmonton, the 2013 ELARB decision, where the board held that it was unacceptable to simply take an average per square foot value of neighboring properties and apply that average to the subject without taking into account the differing characteristics of the properties. Again, we've provided you with some summaries of the decisions, and full decisions can be found at the end of our submission. So in summary, the assessor feels that the comparable sales provided to the board by the respondent supports the assessed value. The most compelling is the adjusted sale price of the subject property with an ASR of 94%. The respondent's comparables are drawn from the same economic area as the subject property, and they're sufficiently similar to the subject in terms of size and quality characteristics. This contrasts with the comparables put forward by the complainant, which are for the most part drawn from other neighborhoods and are insufficiently similar to the subject property. Based on the evidence provided by the assessor submits that the comparable properties provided by the complainant are not similar to the subject property. So we respectfully submit that the property assessment for the subject property is both correct and equitable with other properties in the town of Canmore, and ask that the assessment review board confirm the assessment at $2,215,000. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bannerman. Ms. Blazo, did you have any questions of either Mr. Wailogi or Ms. Bannerman? Ms. Blazo? Are you muted?
Sorry, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? My dog
Yes.
was barking. I put us on mute.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah, okay. Could we go to my rebuttal?
Go to where, sorry?
Sorry, to the rebuttal from the respondent's submission, the first page, so I can ask.
Did you want, does this pertain to questions of the respondents?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. When was the last audit completed, the last formal audit completed?
The
Sorry.
last detailed audit that was performed by the provincial government for benchmark assessments work in the town of Canmore was for the assessment year 2020.
2020. So that would be after or before what I've been proposing that there is a problem with the model. So prior to
correct.
2020, my data says things looked pretty good, and after 2020, my data says things are kind of going a bit south. So there hasn't been an audit since the time of when I am identifying these issues.
And generally, the provincial government, they have a schedule for their detailed audit. So generally, they do occur every 5 to 10 years. That's the general rule. So we're still within the 5 years. And yeah, that's where we are.
Okay.
Ms. Dalrymple, the question when you're out of the room was, when was the last time there was a provincial audit of the assessment? And we heard it was 2020, is that correct?
Yes, the 2019 assessment year for the 2020. Oh, sorry, did that?
My fault, I didn't have you turned on there.
Okay, yes, the last assessment, in detail assessment report was the 2019 assessment for the 2020 tax year.
Okay, thank you.
And just to clarify, that was before the problems that I've identified have started appearing in the mass model results. There has not been a detailed.
We haven't had an audit since that date, but I also am not admitting or saying that there's any issues with our assessment data. We've passed our annual audit annually. The auditors constantly look over our material, our assessments and our data and give us suggestions to incorporate on an annual basis. So just because we haven't had the level of detailed audit since 2020 doesn't mean that we are not still complying with our legislated quality standards.
Would the type of audit or checks that you do annually uncover a subgroup inequity as described by myself in my submission?
So when the auditor looks at our assessments, as well as when we look at our property assessments on an annual basis, we're looking at every neighborhood, we're looking at all the different quality classifications, all the different structure types, property types. We're looking at properties along the river versus properties not on the river. And we do look at the walkout basements versus the non-walkout basements. So it is quite a thorough process where we do test all of the different data characteristics to make sure that they're adequately represented in our models. And that is standard practice for any assessment office.
So my question still is, would it uncover the analysis that you did, the testing that you did on your model, would it uncover the differences between subgroups, for example, no walkout versus a walkout?
Yeah, and I believe I answered that as a yes, it does uncover that information.
And you did not see any, do you have data that shows that you could provide to the board that would reinforce that conclusion?
So if the board would like to ask us to provide them with that information, it would be quite unusual, but they do have the authority to compel us to produce information. At this time, it wasn't information that we've included in our disclosure because it isn't something that we think is relevant to the 2023 assessment for the subject property.
So specifically, what tests did you do on subgroups that allowed you to understand that they were being treated equally? What was the test? How did you do it?
So I'm not really sure if this is the avenue to be asking some of those specifics. We do look at the overall ASRs. We look at, like I mentioned before, we look at the CODs. We do tests on assessment shifts as well. So assessment changes on an annual basis to see what neighborhoods or subgroups are behaving in a different manner than the rest of the population. So just specific to the walkout versus non-walkout basements, I mean, our data set shows that we have a significant number more of walkout basements than has been suggested in the complainant's evidence. And we've also found many instances where not only was it misrepresented as unknowns in the complainant's data, but it was also misclassed where it was walkout and it wasn't, and vice versa. So, as for the specifics, we do those types of tests.
Okay, so on the page, the first page of my rebuttal, there's a graph at the bottom. It's based on the graph that you provided and presented, and it shows a graph that, with all the blue dots, looks like that there is a perfect non-regressive pattern in the data. And my question is, I've also included the data that falls within the window of some properties that seem to be excluded from the graph that you provided to the board. Can you comment on why those properties were excluded?
Yeah, so when we're looking at that, when we had put it into our disclosure initially, we had a different filter on it, trying to explain something a little bit differently. It was missing some of the sales, not just on the over 3.5 million, but it was missing sales on the lower stratum as well. So when we did rerun it with all of the sales in it, it still produced the same results. Some of the sales that have been included by the complainant and pieced into this data set were, again, post facto sales, which normally wouldn't be included in our analysis or our testing.
Sorry, what was the last bit? My dog was barking. What sales wouldn't be included?
Any of the sales that occurred, if they transferred from Alberta land titles after evaluation date of July 1st, 2023, which some of those do as well.
I did filter it, so I think most of those have been, so you're saying that, I don't understand. So why didn't you include these data?
As I said previously, and maybe I'll just say it a little bit slower. We had, in our original disclosure, we had it in there for a different purpose. So when we were running our numbers, we'd filtered something in addition that shouldn't have been filtered. So there were sales in the 3.5 million plus range, but also below that range that were missing from the scatter plot. And I'd really, as I mentioned, some of the ones that have been added by the complainant are post facto sales and shouldn't be included in the analysis. But regardless, the chart is inconsequential anyways to the overall preparation of the 2023 assessment. And so really, I'd ask, even though it was our evidence, for the board to give it little or no weight.
If that data was included, and when you reran it, did you see regressivity?
There wasn't a significant amount of regressivity. So when you're looking at the graph the way it is, if you plot it out where you have every 5% of sales, the low end of where the high end sits, those ASRs sat at 0.945, whereas at the top end, they sat at 0.967.
It would be helpful for me to actually see that, because I just have to take your word for it, and I have to be transparent and share with you all my data. Do you have that available for us to look at?
No, of course we don't have it. It wasn't provided in disclosure, and we didn't take the opportunity to do any rebuttal. As I mentioned, I would ask the board to place little or no weight on this, given the fact that there's data issues with it from both our sides and from the complainant side. And it really is irrelevant in the grand scheme of looking at the 2023 property assessment for the subject property.
Okay, moving on. The MLS date versus the transfer date, would that impact all properties similarly, meaning walkouts, meaning those without walkouts? And thus, would that be a fair statement?
You're muted.
Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. I was halfway through my answer. I'll answer this question, Chair. So looking on my disclosure, I was saying that you made a comment earlier, and I don't think I exactly knew what you meant until now. So I do want to clarify for the complainant as well as the board. So when I was on issue number 1, and that's on page 5 and 6, and I disclosed and analyzed 5 sales where the transfer date was 6-7 months after the MLS date. These are just 5 examples. So it's not just that these 5 properties are the problem. These are just 5 examples of a larger data set where this problem exists throughout. In short, Mr. Chair, and to the complainant, yes, this is a massive problem with the entirety of the data. And depending on when the date of transfer was, the difference between the MLS date and the sale date, the MLS date and the transfer date, which we would call the sale date, would fluctuate throughout the valuation period. So it's quite likely that sales pre-COVID would see differences between MLS date and transfer date quite a bit shorter versus during the 2022 period, where, as I've demonstrated, could be differences 6-7 months apart.
So my question is, would that difference impact all types of properties similarly? Or would they be, in order to assume that it would change the conclusion of what the data is telling us?
Yeah, it would absolutely impact the complainant's analysis and conclusion, because every property would transfer. The MLS date would be different than the transfer date. Just even at an efficient time of processing the documents, there's always going to be a difference between MLS date and transfer date. But it was magnified by COVID and the number of transfers that were going through land titles and the delays in the processing that it is most evident. So in the 2022 year, you'll see your largest differences. And I also made mention to an excerpt that mentioned early 2023, it had gotten better, but they were still roughly about 4 months difference. So throughout the analysis period, the difference between MLS date and the transfer date will fluctuate. I think it was at its highest in 2022. Does that help?
Not really. I think what I'm getting at is that discrepancy impacts all properties similarly because of those delays. It wouldn't be more relevant for the
No, ma'am, it doesn't.
So are you
What
saying
I'm saying is that
properties
some
longer?
properties that sell would have a different.
Are walkout properties,
The difference will change.
but they're similarly impacted. So the relative position of those from an ASR point of view statistically should be consistent.
No, I think it could be different.
The same delay.
I think it could be different.
You think it could be?
Yeah.
Statistically, is it likely that walkout properties have a longer settlement time than properties that don't have a walkout? Because that's the only way it would reach the conclusion.
Let's leave it at this. Before the board, there is no analysis that has been run with your data on transfer date. So that analysis is not before the board. So, I mean, I could make my comments and you could make your comments, but ultimately that evidence and that analysis is not before the board.
Yeah, I understand that. Why hasn't that work been done when I pointed out such a significant potential problem?
Adrian, we did our work with the 479 sales using the correct transfer date in preparing assessment. We've already done everything, in our opinion, and in the auditor's opinion, correct. We've used the 479 sales. We've correctly adjusted them based on the transfer date. All of those sales, non-MLS sales, all of those have been used in the preparation of assessments. They've been audited, as I've demonstrated through the excerpts that I've taken from the annual audit. There's assessment uniformity in the PRD values. All of the regulated standards for each value range has been completed. That is the ASR, the median ASRs, and the CODs, all below 15.
Okay, so you provided me that information, and looking at it, it has the dwellings, single-family dwellings, and they're all grouped together. So if you look at that together and you average the ASRs, you're not going to, would you see what I'm demonstrating? How is it possible, if you're not segregating in that way, that you could see the problem that I have presented?
Well, I think if your assertion was correct, Adrian, I think if your assertion is correct, what you would see in the median assessment ratios at the bottom of page 13 is you would see value range 1, which is the lower valued properties having really high ASRs, and value range 4, which would be the higher valued property at really low ASRs. But what I'm saying to you is that you don't see that. If you take a look at the median assessment ratio going from the low valued properties to the high valued properties, you see relative consistency in the median ASR. So it's 0.962, 0.961, 0.952, 0.952. So there's no significant difference in the median assessment to sales ratio as the value ranges increase from low to high. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. What is the high value range? Where does it start?
So the high value range would be found on page 16.
And what is it?
It would be any property above 1.518 million.
So if I ask the board to look at the graph that I provided, that Benchmark provided, and if you look at 1.5 million and above, you can see that there are so many data points that aren't reflective of the high end. The high end starts at 3 million. The high end does not start at 1.5 million. So the conclusion, if you average everything over 1.5 million, you're including a lot of the data that and many more sales that is not allowing you to see that pattern within that group. Like if you did answer me this, if you did a quartile that was above 3 million, how would that result look? What would the ASRs be? The data I have.
Yeah, we'd have to look, but ultimately it's kind of irrelevant because the assessor is audited based on specific value ranges as set by the assessment audit department. So,
and just to add into that, just to elaborate on Les's question or answer as well, those value ranges are set by the quartiles from the previous year's assessed values. So we are looking at quartiles when we're looking at the various value ranges.
I guess I really can't comment, on that. If that's how you're meant to do it, that's how you're meant to do it. But if it gets the wrong answer, I don't think that's what the board needs to look at and say, does this sale data make sense with respect to my assessment?
Ms. Blazo, this is the opportunity for you to ask questions of the respondents, not get into.
You're right. You're right. I have a couple more, and then we can probably put this to bed. Hey,
thank you.
So, Lance, did you review the adjustments that I made to the sale data date so that I adjusted it based on the average transfer date delay?
we were able to identify areas, as we pointed out on my issue 1, where because the transfer date was significantly different from the MLS date, there was obviously clear differences between the adjusted sale price. So did we do that for every sale? no, we didn't go through every sale. Ultimately, when you go through a handful and more and realize that the analysis is quite a bit different than what the assessor would do, ultimately the analysis is flawed in our opinion.
And just to add on that, because I believe that Ms. Blazo was referencing her rebuttal document. And just for example, the property at 5 Bluegrass Ridge that was included in the complainant's rebuttal, that showed a complainant sale date that she provided as April 1st, 2021. In actuality, there was no transfer or MLS for that date. It actually transferred June 20th, 2024. Just as one example, but as Lance had mentioned earlier, there's a wide variation between the MLS sale date and the land title transfer date. So just using, a common kind of or an average change is still going to create the same problem. It's just moving it up a little bit.
Okay. Back to issue number 2, transfer date parameters. Lance, can you look at the graph that's in transfer date parameters issue number 2 that shows the regressivity particularly, and compare that to the one that I ran previously that had post facto sales, and tell me if you see a different pattern between those two.
I'm sorry, would you be able to tell me the document page or what?
So look at issue number 2 on my rebuttal,
Okay,
and
just
there's there's a graph there, and it shows the regressivity within the model. And if you compare that to the graph that you challenged previously on my initial submission that had post facto sales in it, does that graph look different? Does it give you a different conclusion about regressivity? Because I have made the adjustments that you.
Ms. Blazo, you haven't presented your rebuttal yet. I'm a little concerned that your questions are covering a document that you haven't presented to the board or the respondents yet verbally.
No, this was part of my presentation, I'm not rebutting right now. I'm just referring to information that I provided as part of my overall disclosure. I haven't excluded this piece.
The questions are supposed to be about the respondent's disclosure. Not
Yes,
not about your disclosure earlier on, and not about your rebuttal.
Yeah. So the respondent in his presentation indicated that the data was incorrect and needed to exclude certain items. What I'm drawing your attention to is that data has been excluded, and this is the result.
Ms. Blazo, again, you're allowed to question him about, and Ms. Bannerman about the information they provided, but your rebuttal is when you present your points about why you think they are incorrect or misleading or whatever.
Oh, okay.
You're supposed to be asking them questions of clarification about the material they presented.
Okay.
As I said, I'm a little concerned because there's
Yeah.
it should be black
Well,
and white,
I
it's
guess
turning
it's the point
gray,
of
and that's not
process.
appropriate.
I only do this once a year.
I
So
understand.
okay. So let me just see if I have any more questions. Oh, how many properties was I missing when you included the properties that were non-MLS? Like what percentage would you say did not go? What number of properties did not go through MLS?
Yeah, so it's tough to say, and this is why, Adrian, because in issue 2, I identified 26 properties that were past the valuation date based on the MLS date. Now, that's sufficient for me to explain to the board that there's an issue with the 2 data sets, your data set being different than the data set that the assessor used to prepare the assessment. So identifying the 26 was sufficient to point that out to the board. But the one thing that you have to keep in mind is that there was probably properties that were transferring on MLS in June of 2023, that would not be pointed out by myself in issue 2, but would then transfer after the valuation date, thus making it invalid for the assessor to use. So the likelihood of post factos being greater than 26 is quite high, because it's quite likely that May and June sales transferring or selling on MLS as of those dates would likely transfer after the fact and not be subject to be included for the preparation of assessments. So I can't answer that is ultimately what I'm trying to say, because throughout the issues, all I'm doing is identifying the issues that I would have with your data set being significantly different than the data set that the assessor would use.
Fair enough. My question was about the sales that were non-MLS, not the post facto sales. How many sales are happening in Canmore in this time frame that aren't going through MLS? Is it a big number? Is it, 10?
Well,
How many
yeah,
is
so
it?
the reason that I bring that up is because if you just look at the total number of sales, you're 379 versus 479. One could say that, 100, the difference between the two numbers is attributable to non-MLS sales. But what I'm saying is if there are more transfers that are likely to be excluded because the MLS date is June or May and the actual transfer date ends up to be past the valuation date, then your number of observations then again decreases, and then of course the gap widens. So I can say at a minimum 100, but it's likely quite higher.
So there's 100 sales that did not go through MLS in this time frame. Is that what your data tells you?
Again, it's tough to say because we didn't go and look at the June and the May transfers in MLS to see if they actually were post facto. It's quite likely they were. All I'm saying at a minimum, there's 100 sales difference because we're using 479, and in your data set, there's 379.
But what you've asked or what you've pointed out is that there are a lot more sales than the MLS sales, Adrian. There's a lot more, and you're not including them. And I was wondering, how many of these non-MLS sales am I missing?
Well, we include the non-MLS sales when we prepare the assessment. So they would be included in the 479. So if you're using only MLS sales, right, the difference between the new numbers is likely due to the non-MLS sales.
So I can't tell you for sure that I have all the MLS sales. It's a very arduous process. I can only rely on your number to tell me how many sales that I'm missing that were not MLS sales. How many are there?
Yeah, so it would be the difference between the two. So in our excerpt from the audit, there's 479 single-family dwelling sales that we used, right? And in your data set, there's only 379. And so if we're using MLS and non-MLS, and you're only using MLS, the difference is likely attributable to non-MLS sales.
So I'm pretty sure I don't have a complete data set. So I don't know how many non-MLS sales are.
That is our argument, Adrian. That is our argument. Yes, your data set is incomplete.
Yeah, so how does a person ever challenge anything if we don't have the information and we never have enough? We can't possibly have the information. But that's just a question. I'm going to just pause here and.
No, it's a question. I can answer it for you. It's a fair question and I can answer it for you, right? Because the board's role is to determine if an individual assessment is fair and equitable. So if you think your assessment's either not fair or inequitable, right, you can lead some evidence on those two items. You don't need to conduct an individual audit because that's already being conducted, right? All you have to do is lead the most comparable information. And if that leads you to a value less than your assessment, then there's an issue. If it doesn't, just like my colleague has presented, the most comparable information in your neighborhood of highly comparable properties, and it shows that there is fairness and equity. And that is our argument.
So if if my case is that the model is regressive and I wanted to present that to the board, how should I have approached it?
Well, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, Adrian, I think if an individual has a problem with their individual assessment, you look at information specific to your assessment, whether it be on a fairness issue or an equity issue, and you lead that evidence towards the board to ultimately support your position. I think, you know, it was a great undertaking that you did there to conduct an individual audit, but it was truly unnecessary.
So the question that started this, just to clarify, the number, what are the number of sales that didn't go through MLS?
So the difference between the two data sets, right? So the assessor is using 479 sales. Now that includes all sales, right? MLS sales and non-MLS sales. So of that data set, how many of those are MLS? Well, it's probably close to the number that you have in your data set, right? 370 or so. The short answer is I don't have the specific number of how many sales included in our 479 were MLS sales and non-MLS sales. But if you've led 379 MLS sales around that time frame, and we're using 479, what I'm saying is the likelihood of roughly 100 sales that you don't have in your data set are likely non-MLS sales. Does that help?
I don't think there's going to be a different answer provided.
That helps. That helps. It doesn't. Okay.
Yeah, I think the rationale that's being provided for the answer given is fairly acceptable. I don't know how else you're going to get a different number. I don't know if the board members have a different opinion or want to say.
Thanks, Martin. I think the information that we have before us is what we've received in disclosure, and we've heard both the complainant and the respondent walk through their rationale for the data presented. And so we have the Assessment Review Board regulations that we can follow to make our decisions. So I feel like as a board member, I have enough information at this time to do that assessment of the information that we have before us. That helps.
Karen?
Thank you, and I agree with my fellow board member. I think the question has been answered, and I also feel after reading and going through what has been presented so far, we can go by our regulations and make a decision. I know there's still a bit more information to come, so.
Thank you. Ms. Blazo, did you have any more other questions for the respondents?
Nope.
You're good, okay, thank you. If I could, I ask the board members if they have questions? Any? Okay. Ms. Mara?
I have one. I don't know who would like to answer this, Deanne or Lance. Since the audit in 2020, have there been any significant changes in how Benchmark Assessments assesses properties?
So we're still required to follow Alberta legislation. Alberta legislation was followed prior to the 2020, and it's followed now. Every year, we're annually required to produce assessments that follow this legislation. You know, it's kind of a double-sided kind of question. So since Benchmark's come into town, we've done a lot of data quality cleanup and really improved the integrity of the assessments. Not to say that there's anything broken, it's actually been improved in prior years. We've done hundreds and hundreds of re-inspections of properties, which has changed the data. And on top of that, the market has changed significantly, even in the 4 or 5 years since we've taken over the contract. So since 2020, just 2 years ago, we saw over 22% average assessment increase. So I can't really say that there's anything changed in the assessment that's not directly related to both the market and data integrity improvements.
Thank you.
I have at least one question. If I could take you to your page 8 of the respondent disclosure R1. And I'm going off on somewhat of a different track, but it's going to help me out a little bit, I think. As I mentioned earlier, both the complainant and the respondent referred to the International Association of Assessing Officers. And on page 8, you've very kindly listed the principles of highest and best use and approaches to valuation. I've sat in quite a few assessment review board hearings in my time. I think this is the first time that I've ever heard the IAAO referred to. A little bit more background on that would be helpful. Is it a large organization? Does it represent all countries of the world, et cetera? And do they follow these the principles and the approaches to value that are presented to us today?
So generally speaking, so the IAAO is the International Association of Assessing Officers, and it's an international organization. What they're very much responsible for is offering publications, training, and really support and consistency in assessment practices. So although they are an international organization, and they do have a lot of really good assessment insight and assessment practices, best practices, they have a lot of experts who provide this information for assessors throughout the world. They're not bound by Alberta legislation like we are. So when we're talking about our ratios having to be at 0.95 to 1.05, it was only a couple of years ago where the IAAO standards were 0.9 to 1.1, or 110%. So they're not required to follow our legislation, but we do look to them for our best practices. We definitely look to them for support. So we did reference on page 8 the IAAO, and that has been in a lot of our past years' documentation. And it's just really, we don't generally have to highlight the highest and best use unless there's a question of it in the complainant submission. But they do have, they are known as the experts in the industry for sure.
Okay. I'm just checking. I've got a number of tabs in my material. I wanted to see if there are questions or just things for me to refer to. I don't know if you'll be able to flip to this one. It's page 139 out of your 249 pages. It's 2024 Assessment Review Board Respondent, Appendix A, Case Law, and it's Tricam Well Services and the County Grand Prairie. And it's the board order itself, and it's page 3 of 13. And it's the question, does the Marshall and Swift Valuation Cost Manual produce a more appropriate assessment for the subject when compared to market sales? Can I ask what the Marshall and Swift Valuation Cost Manual is? For clarification for everybody here.
Sure, I could take this one. The Marshall and Swift Cost Manual is primarily used for commercial, industrial type properties, so non-residential. It does have some costing on the residential side, but primarily for residential properties, the Alberta manual is used. For non-residential properties, the Marshall and Swift Cost Manual is used. there are most properties in the town of Canmore for non-residential properties are prepared on the income approach, but there are a select few that are still prepared on the cost approach, and the Marshall and Swift manual would be used.
Okay. Thank you. That I appreciate, and that's all the questions I have. Ms. Blazo, it's your opportunity to present your complainant's rebuttal evidence. I don't know if you have anything you'd like to say to that, but please
I think I
proceed.
did it already, but I'm going to go through it and present it rather than try and ask questions relative to it. I agree with you. I got it out of order. So, in terms of issue number one that was provided by Benchmark, that the sale date versus the transfer date was causing incorrect conclusions or would like you to believe that the data is not convincing. I took the dates that were provided by Lance and I put them into the spreadsheet, and then I utilized the average delay provided by the Alberta government of 87 days, and I got the same answer. It actually, the gap widened between walkouts and no walkouts. So I would happily include all of those dates if I had access to it. But again, we as homeowners have limited access to data. So in terms of the issue number one, I don't think the response from the respondent really has an impact on my conclusion. The next issue was transfer date parameters, that I had sales in there that were outside of what could be considered. So if you look at the graph on my rebuttal, I reran that with excluding those sales and adjusting 3 months for the land transfer date in addition, and I got the same graph showing regressivity. And also to the right of that, you see the bar graphs showing that walkouts and properties, more traditional properties than lower value properties, are being assessed higher than the walkout properties. So I think that really basically says, well, I understand what you're saying about the cutoff for the end of July, so I'll take it out and let's see. And when we look, it's still the same. Then the question of the fact that I didn't include non-MLS sales. Well, first of all, it's impossible for me to conclude non-MLS sales because I don't have the data. But when running statistics and these statistical tests, there is sufficient data that would allow these conclusions to be made. So when you go run these tests, they'll say, no, yeah, you don't have enough data. This is just random information. And there's no conclusion on the Kruskal-Wallis test, for example, or regressivity. The other thing about the non-MLS data, so I have enough data, albeit plus or minus 3 to 6 months. I have enough data to get statistically relevant conclusions. And I would wonder, I suggest to the board that would it be more likely that these non-MLS sales would have a different pattern? How are things being valued in the market is a lot different if it's off MLS. If anything, maybe they're more underassessed. I don't know, but it doesn't have any impact on my on the study. Finally, unknown data. Yes, there is unknown data. We have to go through, in order to find this data, it's difficult. And so painstakingly, I've found a lot of data, but in all honesty, there's some properties, when you look at them, you can't tell. And so if I couldn't tell, I just put it in that category and I left it out. The data that I do have and the number of data points that I do have information for is statistically relevant. And it rejects the hypothesis that properties like mine are being treated equitably. It completely rejects it. It's not even, and then finally, the horizontal equity and vertical measures, it's missing all the high-end walkouts. So the high-end walkouts in my database aren't on this graph. So when you look at that graph of blue dots, horizontal and vertical equity, we draw a straight line, but it's missing these other properties. And so for me, I don't understand why those properties aren't in the data set, particularly, and if this data set, this graph was provided to prove to the board that all properties are being treated equitably, it's misleading. And those properties are in the window, and they aren't excluded because of post lot. So it's given a different, and I would say that the conclusion that it's with this graph doesn't really conclude there's no regressivity. It's just missing data, and that's my rebuttal. Oh, wait, one more thing. The graph that is provided by a benchmark does include 17 Canyon Road, and 17 Canyon Road has an 100% ASR, and it has no lower level. It's just a 2-story. So the model, as expected, based on my research, knows how to calculate that value. And the other data points that weren't included have walkouts. And the other black data point that's at 95% also doesn't have a walkout. So that's my rebuttal to the challenges of the respondent.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the respondent on the rebuttal?
Yes, Adrian, I just wanted to confirm. So when you went back and tried to rerun your analysis using the transfer date, did I hear you correctly? So you didn't use the actual transfer date for all 379. You just had to sort of estimate based on kind of the 5 sales that we had presented in our response to Appendix 1 to 4. Is that correct?
Yes. So I utilized your dates, and then I used the provincial average for everything else. If I knew where to get those dates, I would happily put them in the data set. But to my point before, everything was delayed. So walkouts were delayed, non-walkouts were delayed, apartments were delayed. So it's impacting all the properties similarly. And therefore, what I'm highlighting is a difference between two types of properties. And so that difference would statistically remain the same, utilizing the same model.
I think that's all the questions I have for the rebuttal, Chair. I think we'll address any other responses in our summary. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any questions from the board members on the rebuttal? No? Okay, I don't have any either, so thank you very much, Ms. Blazo. We are at the argument summation. Ms. Blazo, it's your opportunity to sum up your complaint.
So my complaint is essentially, I've looked at properties that sold in a similar time frame for a similar price, and they are comparable, but just not in South Canmore, and they're same distance from downtown, and their assessments are $500,000 per home less than mine, although we have the same market value. And I request that my assessment be reassessed considering those properties. I think it's impossible for me to argue to have it's impossible me to compare my home to another home that has a similar error. And that's why South Canmore designation is problematic. I agree South Canmore is a very wonderful neighborhood, but it's not the homes there when you calculate their value, it's not 100% more than Lions Park. So as I mentioned earlier, that's how the calculation is working. It's taking the home value, exactly the same as mine, and mine gets doubled and relative to Lions Park, and I don't think that's fair nor equitable. And then also, I think it would be prudent and to request the segregated data, particularly for properties that are over $3 million, to say, what is happening? Why are there ASRs of 50% in the plus $3 million? And what is causing that? Particularly when I highlight 17 Canyon Road, which is in that plus $3 million category and has 100% evaluation. And then other properties are at 50% because they have these large walkouts. And that is not a fair assessment system. So in summary, I think more information is required for the board to understand the regressivity in the model. And finally, I also think that my property should be compared to properties that don't have the inherent error in it. And I provided several properties in Lions Park area that have similar market values, but much lower assessment values. And I want my comparison, I would request my comparison be in that light. And I think, and then just a general comment then, which is the data is so hard to get. And in order to really have a transparent system, like the fact that I had to spend $1,200 to get the calculations, to understand where the errors were, and the errors are quite evident. I think it's almost impossible for your average homeowner to actually know if they've been assessed fairly. And I think we should think about that. That's all I have.
Okay, thank you. The respondent, any summation from you?
No, thank you very much, Chair. We always appreciate the opportunity to present in front of the board. Just really quick while it's on my mind, because I have heard it twice. And, I just wanted to clarify for the board that, there is information that requires a fee, and that is the detailed calculations. But I believe we've been pretty upfront in the past in providing general assessment information. That is your general details and assessments. It's just, there is a fee to get the detailed calculations that show all the cost data, that show all the market adjustments. And that's for everybody. But we do provide, I feel, a pretty significant amount of information free of charge to ratepayers, at least to the extent that ratepayers can determine whether their assessment is fair and equitable. It's just when you go and you want detailed calculations, coefficients, market adjustment factors, all of the guts of the assessment, that's unfortunately when the fees come in. I want to summarize our position, Chair, because there's been a lot of data discussed and debated here today, a lot of data before the board, a lot of analysis. Again, our response to the complainants Appendix 1, 2, 3, and 4 is that the overall data, the overall analysis, and the final conclusions we feel is flawed, and we do feel it's a false conclusion, or leading the board to false conclusions. If you remember back to questioning period, Mr. Chair, there was questions raised about the horizontal equity analysis conducted by the complainant, specifically around the filtering. And when you really dig in, you realize that there was an arbitrary filter. And if you look at the data that was filtered out, as we went through in detail, there's a number, I think 5, 6, 7, I can't remember exactly, but there was a number of indicators of walkouts that were excluded from that analysis that had ratios above 1. Now, it's an arbitrary date that the complainant selected. However it was selected, I think she tried to provide some reasoning. Ultimately, these sales were excluded, and if they were included in her analysis, obviously being all ratios above 1, that would have upward pressure on the median assessment ratio, certainly bring it a lot closer to the non-walkouts. So there was some concerns initially with some filtering around the analysis. We did get into a little bit of a discussion around regressivity, and some questions were raised about how you're supposed to analyze regressivity. You'll see in a lot of the graphs in the complainant's information, the complainant is using sale date as the independent variable. Well, if you're trying to analyze whether the assessments are regressive, you should be using the assessment as the independent variable. So I pointed that out in questioning, and certainly it's something that you see throughout the appendixes. Additionally, Chair, we tried to question the complainant on the methodology for the requested assessment. I think in the response itself, there was 13 sales that were used. The complainant, I think took the average assessment level and times that by or time adjusted sale price. To me, it's been very unclear as to what data set precisely the complainant is trying to direct the board's attention to. We have in the original complaint form an attachment of some sales, and then the complainant went off of those sales and then provided 13 more. And then after the response, she provided another set of sales in the rebuttal. So it's been very unclear to me, certainly, and I would think to the board, what data conclusively that the complainant is trying to direct the board's attention to lead them to a recommended assessment. Now, this is completely different from my colleague, Ms. Bannerman, who led evidence which I believe to be the most comparable with respect to location and physical characteristics to the subject property. All of these properties are located within the immediate area of the subject property. They're all highly comparable with respect to physical characteristics. You take a look at the median assessment of the group, the median sale price of the group, the median ratio of the group. All of the sales provided, very clear, very concise, all in a very simplified chart, easy for the board to review. And ultimately, board, it shows the exact thing that we've been saying, in that the assessment is fair and equitable when you consider the most comparable properties. Unlike the complainant, she's going outside of South Canmore. She's going and taking properties that we feel are not as comparable, when she could have stayed within her direct market area, her direct neighborhood, and selected more comparable properties. But I think it would have certainly weakened her case, because as demonstrated by Ms. Bannerman, the most comparable sales support a fair and equitable assessment of the subject property. Again, I won't go into too much detail, but I just want to remind the board all of the issues that we have with the complainant's overall independent audit. Even within the rebuttal, she didn't properly address the transfer date versus MLS date. So all of the properties throughout the analysis period will have differing MLS dates compared to the transfer dates. If it was in 2020, it could be 6-7 months after the MLS date. If it was earlier in the period, it would have been much shorter. And again, I led evidence to suggest towards the end of the period, it was only 4 months. So you can't just address the transfer date issue by just taking an average and then applying it to the group. You have to look at the individual transfer date of each individual property. Furthermore, Mr. Chair, there was a number of sales that were post facto in hindsight that should have been excluded. There is I think 21%, almost 21% of the data that was unknown. And finally, Mr. Chair, of course, the assessor uses non-MLS sales as well as MLS sales. So our data sets are significantly different. So overall, we would turn the board's attention with respect to an annual audit to what the assessment auditor has conducted by way of the annual audit ratio studies. We have met in every category for single-family dwelling with respect to median assessment to sale ratios, CODs, non-regulated standards that analyze bias, that is the PRDs. Everything that we've done in preparing the assessment has been audited and has passed all of the quality standards. With that, Mr. Chairman, we really appreciate the opportunity to respond to the material. And lastly, we would just request the board confirm the assessment. Thank you.
Ms. Bannerman, did you have any comments?
No, sorry, Lance represented both of us. Thank you.
Okay. The last word goes to Ms. Blazo, the complainant, if you have any final comments.
I think the last word is I really would encourage the board to look at the 3 million plus regressivity pattern that I've covered in order to put in context some of the decisions that they've had to make with respect to the fairness and equity of the assessments that have come to you in this cycle and maybe future cycles. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your cooperation and your presentations. I would like to ask the parties if they feel they have been heard today and if they feel they have had a fair hearing. Complainant?
Yeah, I think I've been heard maybe more than you wanted. It was a pleasure to share some of the work that I've been doing, and I hope that we all can learn from it.
The respondents, did you feel you had a fair hearing?
Yes, we do.
Okay,
Yes, Chair.
good, thank you. I will now declare the hearing closed. No further evidence or submissions may be received by the board. The Municipal Government Act requires a written decision within 30 days and gives the clerk an additional 7 days to issue the decision. We will make every effort to meet or beat those requirements, and the clerk will forward our decision to you at our earliest opportunity. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon, what's left of it.